In just 3 weeks, the Red Army lost 600,000 men, and the world saw the scale of Hitler's ambition. 600,000 soldiers, 4 entire armies, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, an encirclement so vast it covered territory the size of Belgium. The Battle of Kiev, in September 1941, was the largest military disaster in Soviet history and the greatest encirclement operation ever conducted. It was also the perfect example of German operational brilliance combined with catastrophic Soviet command failure and Stalin's delusional refusal to acknowledge reality. The Wehrmacht closed a pocket around Kiev through mechanical precision, grinding determination, and a strategic gamble that Hitler forced on reluctant generals who wanted to drive straight to Moscow instead. Those generals were probably right that diverting forces south delayed the capture of Moscow and possibly cost Germany the war. But they were wrong that the Kiev encirclement wasn't achievable or wouldn't be decisive. It was both. For 3 weeks in September 1941, German forces executed the most successful military operation of the entire war, a double envelopment that trapped Soviet armies so completely that survivors described it as fighting inside a shrinking circle of fire until there was nowhere left to retreat. This is the story of how the Wehrmacht closed the largest pocket in history, how Hitler overruled his generals and was proven right operationally, if not strategically, and how Stalin's refusal to authorize retreat transformed military defeat into catastrophic annihilation. It's the story of Operation Barbarossa's southern front, where everything went according to German plans, and nothing went according to Soviet expectations, where the Red Army was destroyed in detail, and Germany won its greatest victory of the Eastern Front while simultaneously losing the campaign by wasting time and resources that could have captured Moscow before winter. Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, with 3 German army groups attacking across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group Center advanced toward Minsk and Smolensk, the direct route to Moscow. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had the mission of conquering Ukraine, destroying Soviet forces in the south, and capturing the industrial and agricultural resources that Germany desperately needed. The southern front was more difficult terrain for German mobile warfare, fewer roads, more rivers, extensive marshes that channeled advances into predictable routes. Soviet defenses in the south were also stronger with larger concentrations of armor and more competent commanders. But the strategic objectives were crucial. Ukraine produced much of the Soviet Union's grain and coal. The industrial city of Kharkov manufactured tanks and weapons. The Donetsk basin contained coal and steel production essential to Soviet war industry. Most importantly, capturing Ukraine would cut Soviet logistics and deny resources necessary for continued resistance. Army Group South's campaign was supposed to be slower, but ultimately more strategically valuable than the northern and central thrusts. The initial German advance was spectacular. Rundstedt's forces, spearheaded by Panzer Group 1 under General Ewald von Kleist, smashed through Soviet border defenses and drove eastward encircling Soviet units, capturing prisoners by tens of thousands, advancing dozens of miles per day. The blitzkrieg tactics that had worked in Poland and France worked in Ukraine. Rapid penetration, encirclement, destruction of surrounded forces, continued advance, while bypassed units were left to follow on infantry. By early July, German forces had covered 250 miles and captured Lvov. By late July, they had crossed the Dnieper River and were approaching Kiev, the capital of Soviet Ukraine and third largest city in the Soviet Union. Soviet forces were reeling, suffering staggering losses, trying desperately to establish defensive lines that German armor smashed through before the defenses could solidify. But the Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by General Mikhail Kirponos, remained largely intact as a fighting force. It had been battered, pushed back, forced to abandon territory, but it hadn't been destroyed. 4 Soviet armies, the 5th, 21st, 26th and 37th, held positions around Kiev, dug into fortifications supplied through rail lines that still functioned organized and capable of continued resistance. Destroying this concentration of Soviet power became the operational focus for Army Group South and the source of strategic dispute at the highest levels of German command. By August 1941, German forces had achieved stunning tactical victories, but faced strategic uncertainty. Army Group Center had advanced to Smolensk within 200 miles of Moscow, but was exhausted from constant combat and needed rest and resupply. Army Group South was approaching Kiev, but couldn't capture it without massive casualties in urban fighting. Army Group North was besieging Leningrad, but lacked the strength to take the city. Hitler and his generals disagreed fundamentally about what should happen next. The generals, particularly General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, and General Heinz Guderian, commander of Panzer Group II, argued for concentrating everything on Moscow, capture the Soviet capital, destroy the government force, Soviet surrender. It was the conventional military wisdom strike at the enemy's center of power and end the war decisively. Hitler disagreed. He believed Moscow was less important than economic objectives, Ukraine's resources, Leningrad's symbolic value, the Caucasus oil fields. He wanted to secure Germany's flanks before advancing on Moscow. The debate consumed August, with Hitler and his generals arguing in increasingly bitter terms. The decision Hitler made would determine the course of the campaign and arguably the outcome of the entire war. Hitler's decision, announced in mid-August, was to divert Panzer Group II from Army Group Center southward, to link up with Panzer Group I from Army Group South, and encircle Soviet forces around Kiev. Guderian's tanks, which had been positioned to advance on Moscow, would instead turn 90 degrees south drive behind Soviet positions and trap the southwestern front in a massive pocket. It was operationally brilliant and strategically questionable. Operationally, the encirclement would destroy 4 Soviet armies and open the route to southern Russia and the Caucasus. Strategically, it delayed the Moscow offensive by crucial weeks, allowing Soviet forces to strengthen Moscow's defenses and giving time for winter to arrive before German forces could capture the capital. Guderian protested vigorously, arguing that diverting toward Kiev wasted the momentum Army Group Center had built. Other generals agreed, but Hitler was adamant, and in Nazi Germany, Hitler's word was final. Guderian received his orders and began the southward turn, cursing the lost opportunity, but determined to execute the mission perfectly. The stage was set for the largest encirclement in military history. The encirclement was a 2-pronged operation, requiring precise coordination between forces separated by hundreds of miles. Guderian's Panzer Group II would drive south from the Smolensk area, swinging east of Kiev to cut Soviet supply lines. Kleist's Panzer Group I would drive north from positions south of Kiev, meeting Guderian somewhere east of the city. If successful, the 2 panzer groups would link up behind Soviet forces, completing the encirclement. Soviet armies would be trapped inside a pocket with German forces surrounding them and no route for escape or resupply. The operation required speed. If Soviet forces realized the danger and retreated, before the pocket closed they would escape and the entire effort would be wasted. It required deception. Soviet command needed to believe German movements were limited, spoiling attacks rather than a massive encirclement. And it required Soviet mistakes, specifically Stalin's refusal to authorize retreat, even when the danger became obvious. The Germans got all 3. Guderian's advance began on August 23rd. His panzer divisions drove south, sweeping aside Soviet resistance, covering 40 miles per day, moving faster than Soviet intelligence could track. Soviet commanders reported German movements, but underestimated the scale and objective. They thought Guderian was conducting raids or supporting Army Group South's advance, not attempting encirclement. By late August, Guderian's forces had penetrated deep behind Soviet lines, crossing rivers, capturing supply depots, cutting roads and rail lines. Soviet responses were confused, and inadequate units were ordered to stop Guderian, but lacked the strength and coordination to do so. German armor simply bypassed resistance and kept moving. By September 10, Guderian's forward units were over 150 miles south of their starting positions and approaching Lokhvitsa, a small town east of Kiev that was the designated link-up point with Kleist's forces. Kleist's advance from the south was equally successful. Panzer Group 1 attacked north from positions around Kremenchug, breaking through Soviet defences, racing toward the link-up point. Soviet forces defending south of Kiev were stretched thin, unable to stop German armour falling back in disorder. By September 12th, Kleist's forward units were within striking distance of Lochwitzer. The pocket was about to close, but Soviet forces inside still had time to retreat if Stalin authorized it. He didn't. Stalin's refusal to authorize retreat from Kiev is one of the great command failures of World War II. General Kirponos, commanding the southwestern front, recognized by early September that encirclement was imminent. He requested permission to withdraw forces from Kiev and retreat east before the pocket closed. Marshal Semyon Budyonny, commanding the southwestern theatre, supported Kirponos's assessment and forwarded the request to Moscow. Stalin refused. His reasoning was partly ideological. Communists don't retreat. Soviet cities must be defended to the last man, and partly based on flawed intelligence that underestimated German capabilities. Stalin believed Kiev could be held, that Soviet counterattacks would stop German advances, that the situation wasn't as dire as his commanders claimed. He was catastrophically wrong. On September 11th, with German forces less than 20 miles from completing the encirclement, Kirponos sent an urgent telegram to Moscow describing the situation as desperate and again requesting permission to retreat. Stalin's response was to relieve Budyonny of command and repeat the order hold Kiev. Kirponos obeyed. He was a loyal officer, a competent commander and a dead man. He would be killed attempting to break out of the pocket 2 weeks later. On September 16th, 1941, the pocket closed. Guderian's Panzer Group 2 and Kleist's Panzer Group 1 linked up near Lochwitzer, completing the encirclement of Soviet forces around Kiev. The pocket stretched roughly 120 miles east to west and 100 miles north to south, containing 4 Soviet armies, approximately 600,000 troops, along with thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, and massive quantities of supplies. It was the largest military encirclement ever achieved. German infantry divisions immediately began tightening the noose, attacking inward from all sides, compressing the pocket, preventing breakout attempts. Soviet forces inside were disorganized, low on ammunition, and fuel, receiving contradictory orders from commanders who didn't know the full situation. Some units attempted to fight their way out. Most were destroyed in the attempt. Others dug in and prepared for last stands. A few disintegrated as soldiers deserted or surrendered. The fighting inside the pocket was chaotic and brutal. German forces attacked from every direction, supported by artillery and airstrikes. Soviet forces counterattacked desperately, trying to break through German lines, trying to escape before the pocket was liquidated. Command and control broke down. Communications were cut. Headquarters were overrun. Orders couldn't be transmitted. Units fought independently, making local decisions, trying to survive. The Germans methodically compressed the pocket, pushing Soviet forces into smaller areas, systematically destroying resistance. Soviet soldiers who attempted to surrender were often accepted by mid-September German forces, had captured so many prisoners that processing them was logistically challenging. Others fought to the death either from determination or because they knew German captivity often meant death from starvation or execution. The pocket became a killing ground where organized military operations dissolved into survival struggles. General Kirponos attempted to organize a breakout on September 18th. He gathered what mobile forces remained, positioned them for concentrated assault against the weakest point in German lines, and ordered the attack. The breakout failed. German defences held counterattack, destroyed the Soviet assault force. Kirponos was killed on September 20th, either from German fire or possibly by suicide, when he realised the situation was hopeless. His death symbolised the destruction of the southwestern front. With their commander dead, Soviet forces inside the pocket lost whatever cohesion remained. Resistance continued for another week, but the outcome was inevitable. By September 26th, organised resistance had ended. The Battle of Kiev was over. The numbers are staggering. The Red Army lost approximately 600,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. 4 armies were destroyed. Over 800 tanks and 3,500 artillery pieces were captured or destroyed. German forces took 665,000 prisoners, though that number includes wounded and non-combatants rounded up inside the pocket. German casualties were relatively light, perhaps 100,000 total, mostly wounded. The lopsidedness reflects the nature of encirclement warfare. The side inside the pocket suffers disproportionate losses because they can't retreat, can't be reinforced, can't resupply. They can only fight and die. The Battle of Kiev was Germany's greatest victory of Operation Barbarossa and one of the most lopsided victories in military history. It demonstrated German operational excellence, the ability to coordinate multiple army groups, execute complex maneuvers, maintain tempo over hundreds of miles, achieve strategic surprise, despite obvious preparations. It also demonstrated Soviet command dysfunction, inability to recognize danger, refusal to authorize necessary retreats, orders that prioritize political considerations over military reality. But was the Kiev encirclement strategically sound? That question divided German commanders then and historians now. The case against the Kiev operation is straightforward. It delayed the Moscow offensive by crucial weeks. Guderian's Panzer Group II spent late August and September encircling Kiev instead of advancing toward Moscow. When the Moscow offensive finally began in early October, the weather was deteriorating, Soviet defenses were stronger, and time for reaching Moscow before winter was limited. German forces came within miles of Moscow in December, but couldn't capture it before winter stopped operations. If Guderian had continued toward Moscow in August instead of diverting south, might German forces have reached Moscow before Soviet defenses solidified? Possibly. Might that have knocked the Soviet Union out of the war? Possibly. The delay at Kiev potentially cost Germany the war's decisive victory. That's the case against Hitler's decision. The case for the Kiev operation is also straightforward. Destroying 4 Soviet armies was strategically valuable. The 600,000 men lost at Kiev were 600,000 men who couldn't defend Moscow or anywhere else. The tanks and artillery destroyed at Kiev couldn't be used against German advances. The territory captured opened southern Russia and Ukraine to exploitation. The psychological impact was devastating. Soviet morale suffered, German confidence soared, and perhaps most importantly, bypassing Kiev would have left 4 Soviet armies on Army Group South's northern flank, threatening German supply lines capable of counterattacking, requiring significant German forces to contain. By destroying those armies, the Kiev operation secured Army Group South's flank and allowed continued advances toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. That's the case for Hitler's decision. The counterfactual is impossible to resolve definitively. We know what happened. Kiev was encircled, Moscow wasn't captured, Germany lost the war. We don't know what would have happened if different decisions had been made. Maybe Moscow would have fallen, maybe not. What we know is that Hitler made a decision, his generals opposed the decision, led to Germany's greatest tactical victory, and that victory didn't translate into strategic success. The paradox of Kiev is that it was brilliant execution of wrong strategy, or perhaps correct strategy executed too late, or maybe the entire premise of Operation Barbarossa was flawed, and no set of tactical victories could overcome the strategic impossibility of conquering the Soviet Union with inadequate forces and insufficient logistics. The debate continues. The destruction of the Soviet Southwestern Front at Kiev had immediate and long-term consequences. Immediately, it opened Ukraine to German occupation. Kiev fell on September 19th, occupied by German forces without resistance, because Soviet forces defending it were trapped in the pocket. German forces continued advancing south and east, capturing Kharkov, reaching the Donetsk basin, approaching the Crimea. The southern front collapsed, not from German pressure alone, but from absence of Soviet forces capable of defending it. The resources Hitler wanted, Ukrainian grain, Donetsk coal, eventually Caucasus oil became accessible, because Kiev's destruction removed the Red Army formations blocking access. In that sense, Hitler's strategic logic was vindicated. The economic objectives he prioritized were achieved. Long-term consequences were mixed. The Red Army lost 600,000 men but mobilized millions more. Soviet industrial capacity relocated beyond the Urals continued producing tanks and weapons. The Soviet Union didn't collapse, didn't surrender, didn't negotiate. Stalin learned from Kiev's disaster. Never again would he so rigidly refuse to authorize retreats when encirclement threatened. Soviet commanders learned to retreat before pockets closed, to avoid concentrating forces where German armor could encircle them to trade space for time. The Red Army of 1942 was different from the Red Army of 1941, partly because disasters like Kiev taught painful lessons. German forces conversely learned that encirclements worked, that Soviet armies could be destroyed, that operational excellence could overcome numerical inferiority. Those lessons worked in 1941, but became dangerous in 1942 and beyond, when Soviet forces adapted and German logistics couldn't sustain repeated offensives. The human cost of Kiev was catastrophic beyond statistics. 600,000 soldiers killed or captured means families destroyed, villages emptied, futures erased. Soviet prisoners taken at Kiev were transported to German POW camps, where conditions were deliberately lethal: minimal food, no medical care, exposure to weather, systematic brutality. Most Soviet POWs captured in 1941 died in captivity, either from starvation, disease, or execution. The Geneva Conventions theoretically protected POWs, but Nazi Germany didn't consider Soviet soldiers entitled to protection. They were Untermenschen, subhumans, to be worked to death or killed. The survivors of Kiev, who became prisoners, faced slow death in camps. The survivors who escaped the pocket faced Stalin's suspicion. Soldiers who surrendered or were encircled were potential traitors, subject to investigation, often sent to punishment battalions or labor camps. Surviving Kiev meant surviving Germans and surviving Stalin, and many couldn't survive both. The tactical execution of the Kiev encirclement deserves analysis because it represents German military operations at peak effectiveness. Coordination between Guderian and Kleist was excellent despite distance and communication difficulties. Both commanders understood the operational concept, executed their roles without requiring detailed guidance, adapted to circumstances while maintaining focus on the objective. German logistics, though stretched thin, supplied advancing forces adequately. German intelligence identified Soviet positions and predicted Soviet responses accurately. German air superiority prevented Soviet aerial reconnaissance and interdicted Soviet supply lines. All elements of combined arms warfare functioned as designed. This was the Wehrmacht at its best: professional, competent, flexible, lethal. The Red Army at Kiev was not the Red Army at Stalingrad or Kursk. The Germans in September 1941 were winning, and they knew it. Soviet failures at Kiev were multiple and compounding. Strategic intelligence failed to recognize the scale of German movements toward encirclement. Operational planning failed to prepare fallback positions or contingency plans. Tactical execution failed to stop German advances or break through German lines. Command decisions, particularly Stalin's refusal to authorize retreat, transformed defeat into catastrophe. Communications broke down at every level. Logistics couldn't supply encircled forces. The Red Army, in 1941, was learning how to fight modern war while being destroyed by an enemy that had already mastered it. The learning curve was steep and paid for in blood. Kiev was the most expensive lesson, but not the last. Hitler's role in the Kiev operation is complex and contradictory. He was right that encircling Soviet forces at Kiev was operationally achievable and tactically decisive. He was probably wrong that it was strategically optimal compared to continuing the Moscow offensive. He demonstrated operational insight that his professionally trained generals lacked. He saw the vulnerability of Soviet positions at Kiev and recognized that destroying 4 armies was worth the delay and effort. But he also demonstrated strategic myopia. He prioritized economic objectives over military ones, focused on territorial gains rather than decisive battle, and dispersed German strength rather than concentrating it. Hitler at Kiev looked simultaneously brilliant and foolish, right in execution and wrong in concept. That duality characterized his entire approach to war, occasional flashes of insight surrounded by fundamental misconceptions about what was achievable and what mattered. The general's perspective, particularly Guderian's, emphasized speed and decision. Get to Moscow fast, win the war, decisively end the campaign before logistics and weather become fatal. That perspective was professionally sound and probably correct, but it assumed Moscow's capture would end Soviet resistance, which was speculative. Stalin might have continued fighting from beyond the Urals even if Moscow fell. The Soviet Union was vast. Its industrial capacity was relocating east. Its manpower reserves were enormous. Capturing Moscow might not have ended the war. Destroying Soviet armies definitely degraded Soviet capability. Both strategies had merit. Both had risks. The tragedy is that Germany needed both to take Moscow and destroy Soviet armies, and had resources for neither. Operation Barbarossa was too ambitious for available means, and arguing about optimal strategy obscures the fundamental reality that Germany couldn't achieve its objectives regardless of which strategy was chosen. The closing of the Kiev pocket on September the 16th marked the high-water mark of German success on the Eastern Front. Everything before that point had gone remarkably well. Frontier battles won, encirclements, executed territory conquered. Everything after Kiev became progressively more difficult. Moscow not captured, winter, arriving Soviet resistance, stiffening German logistics failing. If you chart German fortunes on the Eastern Front, Kiev is the peak maximum achievement minimum cost, everything working as designed. The decline from that peak was initially gradual, then catastrophic. Kiev was the last time German operational excellence achieved decisive results. Afterward, competence couldn't overcome circumstances, and circumstances, weather logistics, Soviet adaptation, numerical inferiority were all working against Germany. 3 weeks. That's how long the Kiev operation took, from Guderian's initial advance on August 23 to the pocket's liquidation on September 26. 3 weeks to destroy 4 Soviet armies, capture 600,000 men, eliminate organized resistance across a front hundreds of miles wide. The speed is remarkable, demonstrating German operational tempo and Soviet inability to respond. But 3 weeks was also time Germany couldn't afford. 3 weeks that could have been spent advancing toward Moscow. 3 weeks that allowed summer to turn to autumn. 3 weeks that contributed to the ultimate failure to capture Moscow before winter. The efficiency of Kiev's execution couldn't compensate for the strategic cost of time itself. The Battle of Kiev ended with German victory so complete that Soviet survivors described it as apocalyptic. The Southwestern Front ceased to exist as an operational formation. Kiev was occupied, Ukraine was conquered, and yet somehow the Soviet Union continued fighting. More armies appeared, more soldiers mobilized, more tanks rolled from factories. The Red Army absorbed losses that would have destroyed any other military and kept fighting. That resilience ultimately mattered more than any single battle. Kiev was Germany's greatest victory and proved insufficient. The scale of Hitler's ambition wasn't just visible in the size of the encirclement, but in what he thought that encirclement would achieve. Hitler believed destroying 4 Soviet armies would break Soviet resistance. He was wrong. The Soviet Union had more armies, more soldiers, more will to fight than Hitler imagined. Kiev showed the world Germany's tactical brilliance. The war's continuation showed the world that tactical brilliance couldn't overcome strategic overreach, logistical limitations, and an enemy's refusal to surrender despite catastrophic losses. In just 3 weeks, the Red Army lost 600,000 men, and Germany won its greatest victory. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. But in September 1941, standing at the edge of the largest pocket in military history, German commanders believed they were winning, believed Soviet collapse was imminent, believed Kiev was the beginning of the end. They were right about Kiev. They were wrong about everything else.